we have our lunch speakers, which this is going to be one of my favorite panels. I was really excited to have our expert speakers, but clinical trials are so important, right? Particularly to have the patient voice. We want diversity in clinical trials. We want to center the patient for clinical trials to make sure that they're the best therapies that they could possibly be. How do we do that? And it's really important to have that conversation between industry and healthcare and patients especially, so that we can have those meaningful dialogues that just really simply don't exist anywhere else. And so we're very lucky to have these experts with us today. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, our lunch speakers. We have Rachel Killian and Kendall James Davis, who are our co-leads for this panel. So Rachel is the Vice President of Advocacy at Intercept Pharmaceuticals, and she brings expertise spanning from bench research through clinical development and product launch. With both a BS in microbiology and a PhD in clinical investigation. And Kendall, she's the head of recruitment and engagement at Sanogenetics. She holds a master's in public health and is advancing equitable recruitment and engagement strategies that really connect diverse patient communities to clinical trials. And we have Tara Kearns, who is the co-founder and caregiver for a patient, and she's the co-founder of the PFIC network, which is right over here, an important partner of the CLA. And since the beginning, in 2018, she has served as both board secretary and is vice president of the board of directors. She currently serves as the program consultant for the organization. When she isn't advocating in the rare disease world, she is a licensed social worker working primarily with adolescents and young adults in the area of mental health and wellness. Thank you. And we also have, I have to put my glasses on. This is very small. Jillian Lusk. And Jillian is the senior manager of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Assessment team at Pfizer. There, she is responsible for providing subject matter expertise on the identification and justification of patient-reported outcomes to be used in upcoming clinical trials. Prior to this role, she worked in the ePro side of clinical research for 10 years, managing the digital implementation of PRO assessments for sponsors. She received her MPH from the University of Pittsburgh. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel who are going to educate us on clinical trials.
Susanna, I need my question list. Yeah, no worries. Thank you. Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. We're very excited to be here. My name is Kendall Davis, like Susanna said. And my pretty much entire background is in rare disease clinical research. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. To kind of kick us off before we get into some of our more specific questions, I was kind of hoping, Rachel, that you could just provide a brief overview of really what clinical trials are, what the phases of research look like, and we'll start there to just give everyone kind of a baseline for some of the things we're going to chat about.
Perfect, thanks. We talk about clinical trials as just one big group, but really there's 4 distinct types of trial that go through from R&D to commercialization or having a product available. So if you think about our phase 1 studies are in healthy volunteers, and that's to look at safety of the drug. Our phase 2 are in patients with the disorder that we're studying, and we're primarily looking at dosing and safety. What's an effective dose? What's too high? What does that look like with the safety profile? And then looking at efficacy sometimes as a secondary endpoint. And it's really our phase 3 trials, and that's typically what you hear the most. They're the largest, and then once we've found that the drug is safe, efficacious, or the dosing that's correct, then we're really looking at that big phase 3 to show efficacy and in what patient populations within that, and that's what's used, the phase 3 data is what's used for submission to the FDA. And then typically we follow that up with the phase 4, which is, can be a registry of what that data looks like in the real world and collecting data from patients that are actually taking the drug in real life. So we'll talk a little bit more in some of these questions, it'll be a little bit more nuanced, but we talk about clinical trials are great or bad or anything in between. We'll get into the details of the different phases of clinical trials, what that means from a patient perspective, when you most likely will, could encounter standard of care or placebo, and some of the things like that. So 4 stages.
Awesome. And I think it's really important to contextualize because we're going to speak a bit today about just the sheer importance of clinical research. And within the context of the majority of research, there are, on a yearly basis, thousands of assets being looked at that could potentially get into clinic and then become a drug. Of those thousands of assets, very, very few will actually become approved therapies. So clinical research is vitally important, especially when you get into more rare chronic conditions, because there are the likelihood of an asset actually making it through decreases, and so the more patient engagement we can have even in the designing of clinical research, the higher probability we have of getting data that's actually going to allow for drugs to make it to market. So actually, Tara, I think I'll start with you. So when we're talking about just clinical trials in general, why are they so important? Like, why are they so critical to advancing treatments? Why are they so important to patient communities? From your perspective, like, what is really the critical nature of clinical research?
So I think in, the patient community, as a caregiver, when we hear about clinical trials, with the idea of that, it comes hope, right? For many rare diseases, there are limited treatment options or no options at all. So when you hear, I remember as a parent when I heard that there was a clinical trial, my first thought is how do we get there, right? Because that lets me know that somebody is doing some research, somebody is paying attention to this thing that is impacting my family. So that's one of the big things when we start hearing about those clinical trials. We want the information. We want to know, how do we access it? What is it going to do? It's promising.
Yeah. You just hit on such a critical point. Within the context of just specifically rare disease, 95% of diseases don't actually have an approved treatment. And so clinical trials often are a care option for a lot of people. And so I think thinking about that too kind of highlights just the nature of why they're so important. Rachel, anything to add from just the industry perspective about why clinical trials really are so critically important to what we're trying to do?
Well, there's always room for improvement in a therapy until we have something that is curative. So participating in clinical trials is the only way that we can move drugs forward, or therapies. It can, it could be a multitude of things as we look at gene therapies and some rare disorders too. But participation is critical. The faster we can move things through with the right patient population, the sooner you have things that are available. And also, as you just mentioned, Kendall, you can, get therapy as being part of a clinical trial. So it allows you potentially access, disease-modifying therapy earlier.
Absolutely. So Jill, not sure if you want to even just maybe provide a brief overview of exactly what it is that you do and what these measures are and how this kind of wraps into when we're talking about why clinical trials are so important, how PRO methodology factors in here.
Sure, absolutely. Before I start, I just want to say I work for Pfizer, but everything I express is my personal opinion, not anything on behalf of the organization. So, as Kendall said, my responsibility is in the world of patient-reported outcomes, which are known as PROs, or PRO assessments. And those are questionnaires, surveys, forms that patients are asked to fill out, oftentimes as part of a clinical trial, to survey the patients about how they are feeling or functioning while on whatever treatment we are investigating. So behind the scenes, I work with teams organizing clinical trials to identify what specific patient population are we studying and what matters to them, what should we be measuring. It doesn't make any sense for us to be asking questions about a symptom like itch if that is not relevant to the condition. So we liaise directly with patients and patient organizations to conduct the research necessary to identify what matters to the patient community so we can measure that appropriately.
And why would measuring that information be so important in a clinical trial?
Sure. So usually when considering clinical trials, the focus is on either reaching something curative or an improved therapy in terms of kind of the clinical outcomes. And that is assuredly important, don't get me wrong. As a complement to that, there's also the quality of life aspect. So if there's a treatment available, but it makes you feel terrible while you're on it, it kind of begs the question, is that a good option? And there's no right or wrong answer. It is a case-by-case basis. So within the realm of clinical trials, when we are capturing patient-reported outcomes, we are gathering the evidence we need to better understand how the treatment does or does not impact the patients. And that is a part of the data that is evaluated by regulators like the FDA to determine if the proposed therapy is sound to reach market and be used widely. So a patient-reported outcome is, I'm biased, obviously, since that's the world I work in, but that is the best opportunity for patients and kind of by extension caregivers to speak their truth about how the therapy works for them and if it's a positive experience or not.
Thank you. Tara, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I can't agree more with what you're saying. It does, as a caregiver, it does. It gives us an opportunity to say more of this, less of that. Is this reasonable? Is this reasonable? Is it functional? Is it possible? It's just, it gives us an opportunity to share our voice in ways that we aren't often asked. So, yeah.
Rachel, you want to comment on that at all? No? I think also, too, when we're thinking about patient-reported outcomes, to the points that Jill and Tara have made, I think that when we're really thinking about what's going to be very meaningful, and accessible to a patient population, again, we need to be addressing the issues that are top of mind. And so when we're thinking about therapies that aren't necessarily looking to be curative, but are maybe addressing a certain aspect of a disease, if we're not addressing as an industry the aspects of the disease that are most important, we're really missing an opportunity to actually create meaningful therapies. And you see a higher likelihood of participants possibly even dropping out of clinical trials because ultimately a therapy isn't, it's not addressing something that's most important. So when thinking about participating in clinical research, Tara, what do you think is most important from your perspective or what you've heard from the patient community as well as families? What do people want to know about participating in clinical research?
So I appreciate that question. We talked about before when families hear about a clinical trial, it does come with hope, right? But then immediately after hope comes fear. So, and it's that fear of, am I doing the right thing? Do I have all of the information? What could happen if I do this? What could happen if I don't do it? So I think a couple of things that become really important for families to know that stick out to me. One is that they're truly educated on the risks, right? Those are things that we don't always love to talk about, but in order for families to give their true informed consent, it's understanding, yes, all of the great things, but also some of the not so great things that could happen, which then kind of piggybacks into just education, right? Education is so powerful. So when families are educated on those potential risks, and then it kind of leads, it starts this trickle-down effect that then they can start asking questions about the other things. What is this going to look like on a day-to-day basis? Can you tell me a little bit about how it's working in my kid's body? Because with education comes power, and I feel like if I know all of the information, as much as you're able to share, right, as much as we know, then I feel like I can then make an informed decision for my child, for my loved one, and I just feel better equipped, right, to include me and to show that trust right out the gate that you're going to give me everything that I need to know. I just think it's a really great foundation.
And if I can add to that, my plug for patients in the room, yes, you're having your informed consent We try our very, very best to show you the risks, the benefits that we know. But it's a two-way street during the clinical trial as well. Just because you're asking questions on the front end and you're deciding, okay, I'd like to participate in this study, you should be asking questions all the way through.
Right.
Something is, different than what you thought. You want to talk to, your doctor or part of the care team. It's a two-way street. I also want to hear if something is, we thought it would be easy, but it's not. Something needs to be changed. Trials can be modified as they go as far as really being patient-centric. It's hard to come in for this many clinic visits, or we want more. So it's a two-way street. Don't remember that. Don't think you're in it and you're through. The saddest part, as I look at the study data, is when we see dropouts, because we think if someone was interested, and you can drop out at any point for any reason. Don't ever hesitate to do what you need to do for yourself, but don't drop out because you don't feel connected or your questions aren't being asked, because it's a missed opportunity for us to give the best care we can in trials. So say the stuff is my short answer.
That's actually a really important point, and I think that it's actually a little bit misunderstood. But if you are ever participating in a trial and you are providing feedback, that feedback is going to ultimately get to the sponsor company. So when we're designing studies, there are a lot of conversations and interactions that happen with the sites to understand, to Rachel's point, kind of what we're hearing from participants about the study, if there are things that are really challenging. So the more interaction and information you can provide back to the site, it is going to trickle up, and it could actually create some change. So to Rachel's point, you should never feel like this is how it is. There will ultimately be things that cannot be changed within a clinical trial, but if you are able to express any issues or questions that you're having, that ultimately will make the entire process better moving forward. Kind of staying on this topic of, when you're thinking about clinical research and possibly even like what patients might want to know, Tara, what are some of the challenges you've seen with regard to how people are accessing information about clinical research? Like, do you feel that there's enough understanding of how to engage with research? Where are people finding out about it? What are they seeing as barriers to actually learning about or accessing clinical trials?
So that's a good question. Being part of a patient-led, organization, we hear from people all over. Lots of people, here in our nation, some people, internationally, and, those barriers and challenges, they vary widely. I think one of the things in my own personal experience, when it came to a clinical trial, this was years ago, I saw that there were clinical trials happening within our own family of diseases, but the hospital that my son was being treated at wasn't a clinical trial site. And I only found it because, as you guys said in my introduction, I'm a social worker. And I don't take no, and I don't know very well. So I searched and looked and looked and looked for myself, and I found it. But, it was never mentioned at my clinic site. I'm not even sure they knew. So by the time I did reach out, the phase they were in had already started. We couldn't join. There were all sorts of things, but that greatly impacted my son's disease progression because I wasn't able to access. And I consider myself, well educated and able to navigate. But there are lots of families that don't feel like they have those skills to ask those questions. So I think sometimes even knowing that a trial exists. It seems so simple, but that's really the biggest thing, because I think after they know it exists, families, we're going to advocate for our kiddos. We're going to find a way, but so I don't know what the change is. I think working closely with the patient groups, the advocacy groups, I think, in years later, after kind of developing the network, we were really we were a large part of getting out information. We weren't, backing anything, but it was more, hey guys, this is happening. Whoever's interested, we'll give you contact info. So I would just recommend to, you know, companies to find those advocacy groups and partner with them. I feel like that'll help eliminate that really large barriers that I know as a parent, you know, we experience.
Yeah,
Can I add to that?
please do.
So, anecdotally, I come from a medical family. My dad was a surgeon and my mom was a nurse. My dad was presented the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, and these are two people who have spent their entire career in medicine, and they found a lot of the communication and documentation around it unclear. So, these people are arguably very well positioned to successfully wade into those waters, and it was still very challenging for them. So I say that not to raise any anxieties in the room, but instead to hopefully normalize the fact that it is a foreign land and it is kind of scary and intimidating. So if you or someone you love is tiptoeing into the world of clinical trials and you feel uncomfortable, don't take that as a sign that this isn't for you or that it's too complicated or anything like that. All sites who participate in clinical trials have at least one staff member who has been trained on the specific trial to essentially be kind of the concierge to shepherd patients and their families through. They are there as a resource to you. So even if, as Tara said, the site you are with is not in a specific trial that you happen to find and you want to know more about, there are registries where you can find sites that are participating and track down contact information for someone who can tell you a bit more information. It might not be the most direct pathway, but whenever we're all thirsting for more information, I think it's important to know all of the avenues available to you.
Yes, that is incredibly true. I think that something that, in my experience, so prior to my current role, I worked with a lot of different companies on actually designing protocols and clinical trials in rare disease, and something we always would suggest would be, you know, when you're even thinking about how you're going to provide awareness about a clinical trial, please do not provide a link to a website that has information about the trial, but then does not provide you with another direct link to actually accessing more information. Making sure that we're creating like all the links in the chain so that if someone is interested, they can, you know, either go to a website or find direct contact information. Please don't put an info at site here because you're going to create a situation where people might get very frustrated and fall out of the process. Rachel, do you feel like from an industry perspective, like what's kind of your thought on this? Do you think that what you guys are doing and what you're seeing and trying to accomplish with regard to accessing or providing information about clinical research, this is kind of lining up with the things you're seeing from the industry perspective?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we can always do better as any industry to have more information available to patients. But it's kind of we have the ethos, and I think it's really trending in this direction of nothing for patients without patients. So there's really kind of, I think, two inflection points within a clinical trial that it is essential to have information in the right place and available and to have patient input. And that's at the very beginning of the study design when we look at what are going to be the endpoints for a study. We look at the clinical endpoints, we ask physicians what's meaningful change in a clinical setting, and I think the industry is doing much better, I'm talking about in general, of then asking advocacy groups, asking patients, what is a meaningful change to you in your quality of life and how that translates. And so being able to incorporate that just out of the gate when we're just thinking about what does this trial look like, what are the endpoints that we include. Now I'm going to show my age, and we talk about a long time ago, we look at these studies that come out and you think, we see this clinical endpoint or a lab value that's the endpoint, and then we ask, well, how did the patient feel about that? What changed in their life? And those, they weren't necessarily included 20 years ago, but I think it is really trending in the right direction of asking those questions up front and then giving them kind of the respect that they deserve, specifically in later phase clinical trials on Sometimes when drugs are approved, why? If we're seeing that big change in quality of life, it's super important. So there's that upfront piece early during the design. I think it's essential that you have it. And then also when we're writing it and it's getting to a stage that it's not fully baked, but it's going into final, is having patients think, does this make sense? Is this feasible? Can you come for this test at 9 in the morning or during this time frame? Do we need to expand that? Do we need to, send someone out to you? And what is kind of not only the burden, but what are some of the potential benefits? I had a patient say, I love that you have more regular check-ins because I only get to see my doctor every 6 months, and in the study I get to see them every 2 months, and so even if there's nothing wrong, it's very reassuring. So it's a good one. Sometimes they're like, I don't want to come in this often, and so this study isn't feasible. We take that to heart because nobody wants to design a study that isn't important to patients and that patients can't participate. So 2 real, I think, inflection points that is critical.
Something that we used to do in one of my old roles, and I would encourage you, give this a shot, but we even would take it even a step further. So once we had designed the protocol and we were actually getting sites ready to go, we would do a site day of run-through, and we would bring either an advocate or somebody from the particular patient community that we were looking to enroll in this trial, and we would walk them through the site visit so that they could point out all of the different things during the day or during the visit that were particularly challenging or things that maybe we didn't think about. And then we would create essentially training documents for all the other sites. And we would say, hey, we did a run through and we found that this was particularly challenging. This is how this site's gonna accommodate for that so that everybody who is gonna be a site could actually learn from this and hear directly from a patient or an advocate what about even just the site visit was really challenging. And it was a really impactful experience, and I think hopefully, it was really fun, and gave everybody a better idea of what was going to be expected and what that experience would look like. So kind of sticking on this point, even with what, again, is really important to patients. Jill, can you talk a little bit more about how you even decide what questions to measure? What does that look like from a PRO perspective?
Sure. So, as is often the case with clinical trials, it's never quick and easy to explain. But the overall reality is that there is a series of guidance documents from the FDA that we are required to comply with. It's known as the Patient-Focused Drug Development Guidance Series. So, for better or for worse, it has a set of specific requirements that all sponsors conducting clinical research are expected to follow, specifically keeping the patients in the focus area of the overall development. So the requirements in that document series outline that sponsors need to conduct qualitative research with the patient population before any trials have begun in order to actually have evidence, not, oh, I worked in this indication 10 years ago and I know that we measured these 5 symptoms. Patients change, diseases change, therapeutic landscapes change. So it's important that sponsors are conducting real-time research into what it is they're measuring and hearing directly from the community they are trying to serve with this new therapy what is impactful. So that is the starting point of how we identify what it is we need to measure. Then we take a step back and we evaluate. There are existing PRO measures that are fully baked, they're validated, they are ready to go. So sometimes we are in a position to be able to use those. Other times, if there's not one for the specific patient population or it doesn't measure some key symptoms that we want to measure, sponsors have the opportunity to develop a brand new PRO. That's a longer road to walk, but still important depending on the situation. So even before clinical trials begin, we are at the mercy, if you will, of patient input because we need the patients, and depending on the indication, perhaps their caregivers as well, to tell us what's important so we can then, when all is said and done, go to the FDA and say, we measured these 5 symptoms because we did these interviews with patients, and they identified those were the 5 symptoms that were most important to them. So it's not lip service, it's not optional, it's a really important cornerstone to everything that comes after it.
Thank you. It's amazing to hear, and I think it's also something that isn't as well understood, and I think that there's a lot of different ways that patients and patient advocacy organizations can get involved in the drug development process, but I think a lot of times it seems like it's further down the road, and so knowing that is, and hearing it explained that way is actually really helpful. So Tara, actually on that point, so what do you think the role of patient advocacy organizations is within the context of clinical drug development, designing, working with sponsors? Like, how do you see that relationship being most effective and impactful?
I mean, I think it's a really important partnership. I mean, like I was talking about before, we can't really go anywhere without it, right? As being part of a patient group, we're looking for people to have an interest so that they can help us with treatment, right, and cure. And then you guys have these ideas, and you need to find a group. So it is this partnership where we need each other, and I think that it can be a really beautiful balance. And I think in a lot of ways, patient advocacy groups, we come with a deep understanding of the burden of disease, those disease experiences, right? We can help raise awareness, spread information, education within our own communities. And then, I just think then as industry, we play there's a really important relationship that we make with industry and the coordinators, the site coordinators. We rely so heavily on building positive relationships with those sites, so that when we're sharing information with our patient groups, we're raising awareness inside of it. We're putting our group to work. We can capture some of those needs. We're doing all of that stuff so that then when we point them over, it is just it can be a really beautiful collaboration. I just know too, in our experience, we've been able to lead whole campaigns around just patient awareness, education. I find it works best when we help give families a prompt, right? Even when you guys, as industry, are trying to gain information about the disease experience. Hey, what does PFIC mean to me? If you had to explain PFIC in one word, what would you do? What would you say? What would that word be? I think as patient advocate groups and populations, those are the things that we can bring to the table. I think we can work really well together. I think we both need each other, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we need each other, and I think we've absolutely experienced great ways to work together.
I could not agree more. Rachel, any kind of follow-up on that, on how you feel like patient advocacy organizations should be involved or are most effectively involved in this space?
Patients are the backbone, the voice is the backbone of any study, and I think it's been a really lovely relationship as far as taking that input, incorporating it in, what's reasonable for one study, what's not, but why would we not ask the additional questions that patients want to know the answer to? So it's very much, I think, a two-way street, and continuing to be, as we move forward with these studies, more patient-centric all the way around.
Well, and I want to add too, there's such an important place for storytelling, right?
Yes.
And I think, we've heard lots of stories while we're here, but I think when it comes to patient advocacy groups, working together in that clinical trial disease study phase, I think there's something really to be said about helping patient advocacy groups, teaching them how to tell their stories effectively, right? It's really an art, and I think that with that support, with that guidance, then those stories do become really powerful, right? But it's like this balance. We want our voice to be heard, but then also working with those groups to teach and train how to make your voice heard in a space is really important.
Well, and I mean, I'll just speak a little bit. I love the patient discussions. I don't know about you, but I have never had a contentious discussion with the patient group in my entire life. We want to hear what you have to say. It's I think it certainly for me has been a very positive experience. I walk away from those having learned and incorporate them in. So that's my ask too, is make your voice heard. Do it through engagement groups. It should be a positive experience.
And I think the more that we as industry can engage with patient organizations and just the community itself, you just learn a bit more about kind of really where all of these stakeholders fit, because there is a lot that I genuinely believe industry can do a lot better. I think we've come leaps and bounds. I think there's still a ton of room for improvement, but I also think that when we can explain in a really digestible way, like why some of the things have to happen the way that they do, and if we can provide a bit more context around like why a protocol design might look the way that it does and why it is going to be really challenging, and help patients understand the need for some of this. In my experience, it's created a situation where people feel more connected to the research that they're participating in, and they understand a bit more about like why they're being asked to introduce this significant level of burden into their daily lives. Jill, just kind of sticking on the advocacy organization question with regard to how they can engage with research, how do you work with patient groups with regard to PRO design?
So usually we are liaising with patient organizations to conduct the qualitative research we need. So if we are pursuing a new therapy in disease X, the most efficient and effective way for us to connect with patients who have disease X and who are engaged and motivated to provide their story are through patient organizations and patient advocacy organizations. It's not realistic for us to, cast a wide net around the entire nation and hope we find kind of the one-off patients that may still have valuable stories to tell, without a doubt. But in terms of the practical reality of connecting the dots, having an active and engaged community of patients who we can reach through the existence of an active and engaged patient advocacy organization makes all the difference.
Love it. So I know we're coming up on time, and I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. So if we could give one piece of advice to sponsors about engaging with patient advocacy organizations within just the context of clinical research, what would it be, Tara? One piece of advice.
I think the biggest thing is, I feel like we've talked about it a lot, but if you don't take anything else away, I do think including the patient voice is the biggest thing, I think, and really valuing and treating that as the gift that it is, right? And I think when families feel heard, when they feel valued, when they feel, it compels them to participate, right? They want to be a part of the solution. But yeah, so that's the advice, I think, just really valuing and caring for that patient voice.
And so to kind of ask the question a bit differently to Rachel and Jill. Rachel, how are you trying to communicate this internally, like as why it's so important to have this type of engagement?
Well, I mean, I think industry here is loud and clear that patient voice is essential, and I think it's getting incorporated more and more in the studies we do. But my ask of you, my one thing to take away from this is patients as a voice have a unified voice, have a public voice, a statement, a presence. When we look to design studies, we can say, what does the patient population need? And when we make, arguments for the design the way it is, having something that is a unified voice for a particular disease state and in a very public way allows us to point and say, this endpoint is needed because of this. Or we're not going to design this kind of study because this is how the patient community feels about it. We all come together and we think, oh, me too, I also feel that way, but make it heard, have statements, make things that are very accessible for us to quickly and easily incorporate what patients want and need into studies.
Can I add something
Yeah.
just really quickly? I think, yes, like you guys hear that patient voice. I think the patient voice is also really important once it's in play, once those trials are in play, that we document the burdens, we document the barriers, that the patient voice is heard all the way through.
Yes.
So that, it is that partnership, it's that feedback, like you said, they want to hear all of that. And so, making sure that you're sharing all of it, right?
Yes, feedback loops are ridiculously important and increasingly being added into like design of trials, which is fantastic. So Jill, I'll ask you, other than, there are obviously the guidances and there are certain things you have to do. Like how would you communicate internally or communicate up the importance of making sure we're capturing the right information from patients and working with them?
That's a good question. So, I think patient-reported outcomes are not very broadly understood in terms of why they are included, what value they bring, et cetera. I think they sometimes get treated as like the little sister of the clinical trial, like, oh, we want to know what the lab values are going to do on the therapy. How the patient feels maybe isn't as front and center in the collective 100,000 people designing the trial's brains.
That hurts, Jill.
I know, I'm so sorry. Not there, it's front and center in many people's brains, not all. So I think it is, I have been in many conversations where it has been very helpful to kind of take colleagues back to the beginning, if you will, and explain why this is important. It's not just because we like the squishy, soft, and feely data or anything like that. It's not just because the FDA says we have to. It's for those reasons and so many more, but most importantly, so that we can get on the right path and stay on the right path throughout the entire decade-long development process of working toward a product that actually serves the patients we intend to serve in more ways than one. So not just the lab values or the clinical outcomes, but also improving their quality of life in some way, shape, or form.
I couldn't agree more. I think that sometimes it gets lost that we are actually all on the same team. Like, yes, people are going to have different priorities, and the business objectives of a sponsor may feel very different from the objectives of a patient organization. But ultimately, we are all trying to bring drugs to market as fast as we can because we don't have time in a lot of these conditions to not get things right the first time. And I think sometimes even bringing it back to that really human perspective, like as an industry, we're great at designing trials to get the data that we need to get through regulatory review. But we're not as great at designing trials that are actually focused on the human that we're talking about here. And so we are seeing this a lot. I think the more patient organizations can engage with sponsors or anyone within the research landscape, the better. And I will open it up if anybody has last comments, and then we can open it up for questions. Last comments from the panel? All right, good. Anyone have any questions? I think there's I don't know if this mic is on, if you want to come up here, but, or you can just shout.
Oh, I don't want to lose my voice. I was talking to Rachel about a very important meeting I have next week that I need to be able to talk at. So my name is Jen Jones. I'm the founder of Sober Livers. Fatty Liver Foundation is our parent company, and we just started a program, a Harrison Fellowship, that you may or may not have heard of. We have a couple of fellows right here. And the whole purpose of the fellowship is to teach the fellows about being involved in clinical trials and the voice of the clinical trials. So I'd like to hear from each of you, what do you think the first thing is that they should learn as they start this journey?